Well, great. And thank you, Madeleine, for setting this all up. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I am Sarah Mills, and I am a researcher at the University of Michigan in our Graham Sustainability Institute, which you all know because this is the second part of our multi-part series. You are here tonight for the second training that we're offering jointly with NEMCOG, the Northeast Michigan Council of Governments, and I butchered it in the process of acknowledging Denise Klein, who has been amazing in helping us pull all of this together. We are supported too by the state of Michigan's Department of Environment, Lakes and Energy, which is EGLE. And so again, welcome and welcome back, since this is part number 2. In terms of operations or organization for tonight's webinar, Madeleine just mentioned that the webinar is going to be recorded, and we'll be posting it to kind of a YouTube to our website after this, so you'll have a chance to review it if you want. We'll let everyone who is attending know once the video is posted, but also we'll kind of splice out things, so don't worry, the names of participants won't be visible. We'll make sure we'll kind of splice out question and answers. In terms of kind of, I don't know, housekeeping rules, at the bottom of your screen you should see a chat function, and throughout kind of the slides, feel free to put in questions as they come to you. And we have a number of spaces throughout where we'll stop and kind of take those all together. We'll also pause at that time if you want to, instead of typing out any questions that you have, if you want to talk them out, you can indicate that you want to speak by raising your hand. And in Zoom, you do that down at the bottom. There's this reactions button, and when you click on it, it'll open up this bigger box, and that's where you can raise your hand. And that lets Madeleine and I know to make sure that you can unmute. We set everybody to mute because I don't know about you. We've been on lots of webinars where people can't find that mute button, and it gets kind of rowdy. So we're happy to have you talk out your questions rather than type them, but that's why you're set to mute right now. Let's think. So it's not just going to be me talking today. I am delighted to have with me again Madeleine Crawl, who is our clean energy land use specialist here at the University of Michigan, and we're going to kind of tag team throughout tonight's presentation. We'll cover planning for renewable energy, and then which Madeleine will cover. I'm going to come in and talk about zoning specifically for wind and solar, and then Madeleine will talk more about upcoming events. So with that, I will hand the stage over to Madeleine.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. So I'm going to start us off with a little bit of a background on planning for renewable energy. And while some of you might be curious to jump right into zoning or have the urgency to do so, if members of your community maybe have already been approached about a renewable energy project, being a planner, I do have to encourage you to consider a couple of things with regards to planning for renewable energy before diving into zoning. So let's start us off with a couple of thoughts on renewable energy. Even without a comprehensive redo of a master plan, there are a few helpful conversations to have in your community before updating your zoning ordinance. And the central idea is to plan for renewable energy, is to decide how renewable energy fits into the long-term plan for your community. To determine the use of renewable energy, and now my telephone is ringing, great. You can use your community vision already laid out. Excuse me. To determine the role of renewable energy in your community, you can use your community vision already laid out in the master plan, and by giving thought to the existing goals in your master plan to see how those fit with solar and wind. To do so, We'll talk about each of these steps a little bit more in depth, these essential planning steps. We will first look at a resource analysis to assess which areas within your jurisdictions are even under consideration when we're talking about renewable energies. And then afterwards, we'll look at common master plan goals. Those could be energy specific, but don't necessarily have to. And especially those that are not energy specific, we are going to focus a little bit on the synergies and conflicts of those existing master plan goals and how they are compatible or incompatible with renewable energy. So to get an overall snapshot of the renewable energy potential in your area, the National Renewable Energy Lab, in short NREL, has a tool called SLOPE. It provides a bunch of information about current energy usage, both electricity and natural gas, projected usage in the future, but also resource potential based on physical characteristics of the landscape, as well as like the windy and sunniness in your area. So here you can see that I've pulled out the data for Sheboygan County, just as an example, where there's lots of utility scale solar potential, which is the big yellow bar, and then also a rather large potential for distributed or on-site wind in this tealish color. The bright blue bar in the middle is marked as land-based wind. That's utility scale wind. And then there's also some commercial and residential solar potential, which are the two smaller bars. And this is just based on like existing rooftops, for example, and their solar potential. This tool is rather intuitive to use, but one of the limitations of this tool is that you can't get township level data. It only gives you data in aggregate on the county level, but even so, it helps to put into context what's the biggest opportunities in any given county. On this slide, this table helps to understand how NREL kind of gets to their assessment. So this table shows which spatial and physical elements make a particular technology viable or not. Whoops. For example, supporting factors for large-scale wind energy in the last column are obviously wind speed, but also existing access to existing transmission lines or substations, as well as the proximity to a major road. On the other hand, elements such as like wooded vegetation or steep slopes reduce the land area that is viable for large-scale solar, which is reflected in the middle column. This leads me to my next aspect on resource analysis to assess which land is even under consideration for renewable energy development, which is land availability. So for large utility scale projects, the economies of scale for renewable energy play an important role. Developers are often on the hunt for places with large tracts of land or where they can assemble these large projects. The larger the lots, the less land assembly is associated with the project and makes it easier. So wind projects typically need many thousands, even tens of thousands of acres, but the average solar project under development these days requires close to 1,000 acres. It is possible to have small utility scale projects, particularly solar, on like brownfields or parking lots, but these types of sites often come with other challenges because they just aren't as big. And in order to really see more development on these scale, these projects typically require other supportive policies such as incentives, a reduction of property taxes, or an expedited permitting process, for example. Developers and utilities consider many factors when determining locations for potential utility scale renewable energy projects. And so far, we've talked about the technical generation potential, spatial and physical requirements, and land availability. But a very crucial one that developers and utilities consider is the access to the grid. So utility scale projects most commonly feed into transmission lines or larger distribution lines if they're over 69 kV. Ideally, this infrastructure is located within 3 miles of a project site. And the closer the utility infrastructure, the closer to utility infrastructure a site is, the lower cost that site will be to develop and more attractive the site will be. Extending a line by a couple of miles is dramatically going to increase the cost of a project. So these 3 miles are really where it's at. Small on-site projects such as community scale solar projects may be connected to distribution lines, but would require a grid study to see if that particular distribution line is capable of carrying that load, which widely varies from distribution line to distribution line. To find out where transmission lines and substations exactly are in your area, there's this great tool called the Energy Zones Mapping Tool, in short EZMT, which is developed by the US Department of Energy. This tool is a map-based tool to identify areas within the US that may be suitable for power generation and energy corridors. And besides showing transmission lines and substations, which is this map with the red lines that you see on the slide for Michigan, there are more than 100 data layers providing a lot of information that you can like turn off and on, such as on the location of habitats, of airports, etc. And this tool also includes pre-run models for utility scale solar and wind. For example, the orange-yellow map is showing wind potential or wind suitability in Michigan. So this tool is a little bit trickier to navigate than SLOPE just because of how complex it is. But it's I'm so sorry. This is a new headset. I do not. It doesn't fit me very well. So compared to SLOPE, this is way more complex, but it's also great in the sense that it has a much smaller scale. Like you can really zoom in to your township level and you're not restricted to the county level, which is what SLOPE is using. So we have created in the past a demo and a tutorial on how to use this tool, which are both linked here. And you can also find these on Graham's YouTube channel. And I've also indicated the link to the tool down at the bottom for you to give it a look if you like. All right, so we have talked a lot about resource analysis and the tools and factors to consider that help provide an understanding of where and how renewable energy development might be viable in your community. Now let's take a look at the second planning step, the goal analysis. So you could already have energy specific goals in your master plan or are currently considering to undertake a replan and incorporate energy specific goals. This is how it could look like. This is an example of a solar specific goal. It suggests different scales of solar, as it mentions, encouraging local production of solar energy on new and residential commercial constructions like rooftops, and to increase the production of solar while minimizing potential biological, agricultural, visual, and other environmental impacts. But if you do not plan to replan, let's look at how existing goals fit with both solar and wind. First, this is how solar might or might not be compatible with typical master plan goals. If your master plan, for example, includes natural resource protection as a goal, this seems to be a rather compatible goal with solar energy development. After all renewable energy, by definition, makes use of a natural resource that cannot be depleted, and solar energy helps protect a habitat for species compared to higher impact energy facilities. Similarly, solar energy and the goal of economic development go hand in hand. A solar project simply is an opportunity to expand the tax base and provides additional income to landowners. But not all goals are going to be compatible with all scales of solar. Take natural features protection goals like on-site tree preservation or historic preservation. Is solar a competing goal? It might be so. So finally on my list is farmland preservation. Many communities have goals of protecting farmland, and solar is often thought to be conflicting with this goal. But whether it really does comes down to how your community defines farmland preservation for yourselves and what you're trying to preserve. In part one, the last time, we talked a little bit about this as well, where we talked in depth about farmland preservation and whether in your community, the focus is more on like the rural vista or on land for growing foods or farm livelihoods. All these fall under the umbrella of farmland preservation and yet have very different meanings for solar development. So solar projects can be an opportunity to help farmers diversify and sustain agriculture, but it might be seen as a competing land use if you are trying to protect land to produce food. Let's do this again with wind, because wind plays out a little bit differently with some of these goals. So primarily, wind projects are an economic development opportunity as well to expand the tax base and provide additional income to landowners. But wind might not necessarily fit very well with all forms of economic development. For example, take tourism economies. We see a lot of conflict between wind. We see less conflict between wind and farmland preservation than with solar projects. After all, the footprint of a wind turbine leaves plenty of space around it to continue farming activities. And a wind project is an opportunity to help farmers diversify and sustain their agricultural production, similar to solar. But there are greater conflicts with the goal natural resource protection with regards to impacts on birds or bats, though newer technologies for wind turbines are in place to cater for these concerns as well. Lastly, a master plan goal of preserving natural beauty of a landscape. This appears to be a very controversial fit with all scales of wind energy development. So you should be getting a sense that communities not only need to rectify goals that compete with the different types of renewable energy generation, but also to look at the different scales of renewable energy as it relates to master plan goals, visions, or objectives. So this table provides a slightly more detailed hypothetical analysis of commonly seen community goals relative to scales of solar and wind energy development. Let's focus, for example, on the first 3 rows. So let's take the example of the goal of increasing walkability and mixed use in a district. While small scale solar is very much compatible with that goal, think of rooftop solar, all the 3 other categories, large solar and both small and large wind, are rather not as compatible if you think of a dense mixed use setting. Let's consider the conventional goal of farmland preservation in the sense of preserving land for growing food. Based on the current tenor of the conversation in most media and communities, it seems that all scales of renewables support farmland preservation, except large-scale solar. But what if the community goal was more about farm viability? Then it appears that all types of renewable energies are compatible with that goal. Before leaving the slide, I just want to stress again that this table is hypothetical and there's no research tied to these labels of yes or no. This was simply created for the sake of emphasizing the need to talk about scale and not just the energy type, and to serve as a starting point for conversations in your community. And maybe some of your master plan goals are on this, or maybe not. And then we're happy to help figure out how we would interpret that compatibility with wind and solar across the scales. So the past slides have summarized the different aspects to consider when planning before jumping into zoning for renewable energy, as we have covered resource and goals analysis. And now I will hand it off to Sarah to start us off with some key considerations when zoning for wind.
Before we do that, though, I thought that I would get it so that I can see your faces and see if there's any questions that folks have about planning. There's a couple that came into the chat that I think we can address now. Oh, and I just closed my chat. Just a minute. Expand. There we go. So one is about how wind may affect bird life. And this is one of the things that, as Madeleine noted, can be kind of seen as a competing use. We talked about last time around how the impacts that turbines may have on birds varies based on the bird activity in that area. There are mitigation measures that can be done, but in places where there are kind of lots of migration paths or lots of kind of special bird activities, there may be impacts. So that's the kind of answer to that one. And there was also the question about wetlands, and renewable energy projects also have to comply with Eagle's wetland requirements. So that is one of the limitations. So, you know, not all land is going to be viable for wind or solar, because it's going to have to stay out of wetlands. There was another question about solar on ozone and the environment, and I have not seen anything on ozone. Madeleine, have you? Solar and ozone?
No, I have not, but I can note this down and find out more about it and then share a response through email, if that's okay.
Yeah. Eric asked, are power tower solar and dish engine solar systems still viable options that can be used today? Oh, that's okay. That's a great question. So what this is effectively referring to is not solar photovoltaic, like the panels that you see often on people's roofs, but instead mirrors, more or less, where they concentrate the sun's rays to a power tower, usually molten salts. And there's some benefits of that because that molten salt can actually hold, it works like a battery. But it is not super common. There are more environmental issue kind of concerns around that approach, because you have these gigantic mirrors, more or less, with, you know, again, concentrating the sun's rays. It's not something that's ever been talked about as being viable in kind of the Michigan context. And third, the cost of solar photovoltaics, the solar panels, again, that we can imagine on our roofs, has come down. So effectively outcompeting kind of concentrated solar. Again, for the rest of this, we're going to talk about zoning for wind, and then we'll talk about zoning for solar. Is there anything else on planning? And if you don't want to type in, that's totally cool. You can either raise your hand through that reaction button and unmute. You might actually be able to just unmute without us unmuting you. So you can chime in now. If there's somebody that's dialed in, and this is, I think if you want to indicate that you're interested in speaking, you can push *9 on your phone, and that effectively raises your hand on your phone. Okay. Seeing no one, I'm going to move on then to talk about zoning for wind. Okay, so everything that I'm going to talk about largely follows the outline set in the MSU Extension sample zoning for wind energy systems. And again, you can link to that here. The first half of that document is effectively kind of an explanation and putting wind energy within the context of a lot of case law and a lot of the research that's been done on public acceptance and procedural elements of wind energy. But the second half of the document is a fill-in-the-blank sample zoning ordinance. So today what we're going to talk about largely is high level, like how you might fill in the blanks. Overall, there's 3 big considerations that you'll want to give when you're thinking about zoning for wind and really zoning for anything. The first thing is determining which districts are appropriate for wind energy, and again, of the different scales of technology. So both wind turbines as an accessory use, where someone might have a small turbine to power their house or their farm, and then wind energy as a principal land use. This is kind of the wind farms that we think of. The next consideration that you'll need to think about is the ordinance structure. So what sort of process would an applicant need to go through in order to get that land use permitted? So is that land use permitted by right? Or is it a special land use, or are you using an overlay district? And we'll talk a little bit about each of those things. And then most of the time is going to be spent talking about those specific zoning standards. Again, kind of how you might think about filling in the blanks within your zoning ordinance. In terms of thinking about the zoning districts where wind is appropriate, I think it's really important to know that it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can determine that certain districts are eligible and appropriate for wind and others may not be. So for small scale, this is kind of accessory use wind. Many communities determine that they are compatible in most situations. That, turbines that are 50 feet, 100 feet high, effectively the height of a TV tower, a personal TV antenna tower, not necessarily a cell tower, tend to be not controversial in most communities. And often they're linked to kind of master plan compatibility because it allows for that homeowner to be more self-reliant in terms of from an energy perspective. Utility scale, kind of the wind farm scale, is where things often diverge. Typically, most ordinances would find that wind turbines are compatible with the goals that are common and kind of the land use intentions of their agricultural districts. Often they're light or heavy industrial districts, possibly commercial districts. They find typically, most communities would suggest that wind is not as compatible in residential districts and those commercial districts that are really geared towards retail sales. What I would suggest is that AR districts, the ag residential districts, are the hardest because it is mixing a land use, agriculture, where wind tends to be pretty compatible with a use, residential, where they're not. And my sense is, just looking across Michigan zoning ordinances, there's a lot of AR districts, and there's often a lot of competing opinions about what ought to happen in those AR districts. And so this is one where, particularly if you have an ag residential district, you're going to have to figure out how to think about wind in the context of what it is that your AR district is actually doing. The next thing that you're going to need to think about within the context of your zoning ordinance is how this land use is structured, like how it's permitted. So typically for small scale turbines, they're often done by right as an accessory use. Again, in the sample ordinance, the MSU sample ordinance, they're not defined as an accessory use, but in practicality, that is how they are used. And so typically you would treat them as an accessory use. And in most cases, in many districts, you would have them by right. In most situations across the state, for utility scale, they would be treated as a special land use. You would require a special land use permit in the districts in which they would be at all allowed. Sometimes in some places, wind has been regulated through an overlay district. So that is to say, it's not changing the underlying zoning of a piece of property. That piece of property would stay industrial or it would stay agricultural, but you define an area where this wind overlay, where wind could be allowed or could be seen as compatible. And you have effectively two zoning layers that are on top of each other. The reason or the place where you would do this is if you have just one gigantic ag residential district in your township. And part of that ag residential district is really residentially, and the other part of it is really agriculture. And you think that this is more compatible in the more agricultural part of this. This allows you to kind of differentiate within that overall context, and not open up the entire ag residential district to wind, but also not exclude it entirely just because you have a decent amount of residential going on. So that's a tool that you can use. And this is even more common. It's not necessarily, we don't necessarily talk about it very much in the solar guide, but this approach I think is a good one for solar, for large scale solar development as well, to effectively allow for differentiation across what in many communities is a relatively large ag district. One of the things that you should think about if you use an overlay approach is that the process of kind of redefining where that district is a rezoning application. And so it is kind of subject to referenda. I would strongly suggest that if you're gonna use an overlay approach, that you, as the Planning Commission, as the Township Board, determine where you want that overlay to be, what is acceptable in your mind, and put it down on paper at the same time that you're doing the rezoning, or that you are kind of establishing the district. Proactively applying that overlay helps you avoid a lot of conflict of interest and complications that might come later on if there's a developer who's interested in your community. Okay, so now this gets into the laundry list of kind of some of the specific regulations that you commonly see for land uses, and maybe you don't commonly see for all land uses, but that are areas within the sample ordinance where you would effectively need to fill in the blanks. So I'll start with accessory use and small turbines. A key consideration to think about for these is the definition. Typically you would define it by the overall height, or effectively that it's producing power that's intended to be used first on site. But another big consideration is often associated in terms of kind of height and setbacks. One of the key things that I encourage communities to think about is, like, how do you treat TV antenna in terms of how close they're allowed to be from the property line, their setback distance. Commonly for kind of these small turbines, you can change it based on the distance. 1 times the height tends to be sufficient. You want to make sure that if someone installs a small turbine that they meet electrical permits, but overall the kind of regulations associated with small turbines tend to be pretty limited. There's not much more than what you would have if somebody wanted to put up the TV antenna. Everything now that I'm going to say is talking about wind farms. So large kind of principal use wind energy facilities. And the first one that may come to mind, well, the first one that I have in the slides, and that honestly within your zoning ordinance tends to be really consequential, is height. So if you are trying to be amenable to wind development, if you think that there ought to be a place for it, and particularly like if you want to future-proof your ordinance so you don't have to change it every time the turbine technology changes, it's the recommended practice to not set a maximum height, because turbine technology is changing over time. And so that's one of the key recommendations. In the sample ordinance from MSU, you won't see a maximum height limit from wind turbines. If you have a height limit for other tall things, really tall things, honestly, like if you carry that forward to wind development, that's a way that you're not going to get a wind farm. Any limitation that in today's practice that is less than 490 feet, it's going to have the effect of meaning no wind farm. And I don't know if Denise is going to raise her hand, but when we did this in person a week ago, she raised her hand and said, how does this comport with kind of the requirement in the Zoning Enabling Act that you not ban a lawful land use? And that's a good question. There are ordinances in the state that have a height limit that is less than 490 feet. To date, to my knowledge, they have not been taken to court, but it is a lawsuit waiting to happen. So I would keep that in mind as you are thinking about regulating for wind. That height is unless you again have limitations for other very tall structures, this is not where you, it's probably not advisable to put a height limit for wind turbines. The other, or the next most consequential decision associated with wind development, and that really impacts kind of the viability of a particular community for wind development, is the setback distance. And for wind turbines, it's common to have setbacks from a range of different things. So setbacks from property lines, of participating people and non-participants. That's people who are paid. And I'm going to show you actually a graphic in just a minute about what I mean by that. Sometimes there's setbacks from occupied structures. So houses, more or less. Sometimes there's setbacks from special natural features. The most common that we see in Michigan is setbacks from rivers. And again, the reason that you might do that is from extra bird or bat activity along those rivers. And setbacks from roads or public lands. Again, I said it leading up to this, and I'll say it again. This is really crucial for determining the viability of a project. And setbacks are also really important for safety reasons. So it is very reasonable and appropriate to have a setback of 1 to 1.5 times the height of the turbine, just in case something catastrophic happens. Again, it's rare that turbines lose blades or fall over, but it's not impossible, and there are examples of this happening. And so making sure that there's a setback in case of failure is important. But there's lots of information out about, about different setbacks that are often intended for different purposes. And so and how setbacks play out can really vary from community to community based on how big your parcels are. And so it's really, really helpful to have GIS to help you model what the impact of your setback is. I have some really non-professional graphics to show you kind of what that might look like. But in order for those to make sense, I first realized that last time around, when we saw you all in January for training 101, I didn't give you wind development 101 to help you understand kind of what this looks like. So, and the difference between participating and non-participating neighbors. So I'm going to give that first and then go back to talking about setbacks. So wind developers first don't usually own the land that the turbines are placed on. They have an easement or lease agreement, a long-term lease agreement with a landowner. And so the first thing that they do is go into a community and try to get folks who might be interested in having a turbine on their property to sign up. And you can see I've shown them here in blue. They take that information along with information about where there is endangered species, where there's eagles, what the setback rules are, and determine effectively where the turbines can be placed. There's a couple of different models that have been used across the state in terms of who then gets compensated once that wind farm is built. So the old model is effectively a winner takes all model. And the only people who are participants are effectively those people who have a turbine on their property. And they're usually compensated for the land that's taken out of production, which is actually pretty small. I think we talked about this last time in the training. It's about 1 acre to 2, and most of that's for the access road to get back to the turbine. And sometimes they're also paid a royalty, which is similar to kind of oil and gas leasing, where it's a percentage of the profits that are made when, in this case, the wind energy is sold into the grid. A newer model in the state has more participating landowners. So it's a kind of a model that's borrowed from oil and gas development. That's a pooled royalties model. So any of the people who originally signed leases would share in that royalty portion, usually on a per acre basis. So if one farmer's got 80 acres in and the other farmer has 80 acres in, but the turbine is on this guy's land and not this guy's land, they're going to share some amount of revenue, but this person with the turbine on their property is still probably going to get a little bit more, just because, you know, they've got a couple acres that they don't have ability to farm anymore. The newest model in the state, and this is what is in the wind space largely used, it includes even people with smaller parcels who wouldn't have been approached initially because they don't have enough land to actually host a turbine on it, but who, even so, like the developer needs free access to the wind that's blowing over these parcels. If somebody on one of these small parcels put up a cell tower, it's going to affect the wind downstream, and so those people are compensated too. In this situation, all of these areas that are shown would be participants, and the people here that aren't shown at all are non-participants. And very commonly, zoning ordinances distinguish between participants and non-participants. There's shorter setback distances if you're a participant than if you're a longer participant. And the idea is, you know, kind of protecting the rights of those who don't have an agreement with the developer. Okay. So with that background, now you've got another series of not so great graphics. Okay, so to show you how and why this is really consequential. So this is actually more or less to scale. This is intended to be a 1 mile by 1 mile section. And so this would be a hypothetical setback of 1,000 feet. That's 2 times the turbine height from a road or from a non-participating property. And in this situation, our non-participant is down here. So everything that's shown in pink is the area where a wind turbine, hypothetically, from a zoning perspective, could be built in this situation. And so if these folks are all participants, they may well have the possibility of having a turbine on their property, and so generally might be supportive of such a policy. Typically speaking, though, the non-participants tend to think that a 2 times the turbine height setback is too close to their property, and so they might be asking for something larger, so 2,000 feet. And in this situation, it's applied to both roads and to non-participating properties. And you can see in that situation, there's nothing left in the township. Like there would be no wind turbine in this particular section. And there's not even tons of parcelization, honestly, in this section compared to a lot of sections. Okay, so maybe there's a happy medium where you retain kind of a 1,000-foot setback from a road, but you've got a 2,000-foot setback from a non-participant here. And potentially this is a happy medium. This person here may feel like there's some additional buffer and protection. Maybe a couple of turbines could be placed in this spot here. This guy might not be happy, or this person not happy because they don't have something on their property, but you know, maybe this is kind of splitting the difference. The trick is, though, the regulations here are the same. That only worked because the non-participant was on the corner. Once that participant is in the middle of, you know, the middle of the section, again, this goes back to a place where there's no spot within the section that would be viable for wind development. What I think is really important when you're thinking about setbacks is that the impact that a particular number or multiplier that you use arrive at, the impact that it has on the ability to have a wind turbine or not in your township, it really depends on the size of the parcels that you have, the number of parcels that you have, because when you're setting back from parcel lines, you know, there's going to be, the more parcels you have, the kind of less area you're going to have any kind of potential, and really the distribution of those parcels. So particularly if there's a lot of parcels residential parcels kind of in the middle of a section, that's, that it's really going to limit the ability if someone in this section did want to have wind development. So it's not easy to arrive at a happy medium, and the sense is that you will probably end up making everybody a little bit upset. But this is where it's really important to kind of go back to what is your intention within that district, and to also think about what is it that you're trying to set people, what are you trying to achieve through that setback? Is it a sound separation, which you could do, sound dissipates with distance, or is it a visual separation? Again, when we're talking about turbines that are 500 or 600 feet tall, even an additional 1,000-foot setback is not necessarily going to look all that different to people's perceptions. So is it a safety setback, which is the one where you have the strongest legs to stand on in terms of zoning when you're thinking about regulating for the public health, safety, and general welfare? And again, kind of a setback distance of 1 to 1.5 times the turbine height makes tons of sense from a safety perspective. But oftentimes there are larger setbacks that are suggested for other reasons. And it's really important to kind of go back to figure out what is it that we're trying to set back from in this particular distance, in this particular district, I should say. Setbacks and sound are linked, as I just noted. And it is very common to see sound regulations in an ordinance. If you are going to include them, though, there's a lot of there's sound regulations in wind ordinances right now that are tricky. They're not actually enforceable because you need not just a number, how many decibels, but you also need the method of how long you are measuring, how long you're listening effectively for the sound. And that is something that I know that it's important. I also know that that is not my expertise. And it's very few people's expertise. You really need to get an acoustic engineer involved if you want to do something that is kind of beyond the standard boilerplate language. It's possible that you can have different sound thresholds for according to district. You can differentiate between different types of sound, different times of day. If you're gonna have a sound regulation, you need to make sure that you know what the sound situation is in your community before the wind farm, because not all communities are as quiet as what people might think. And so if you set you wanna know the difference between that a potential wind farm would make on the sound. So, a couple of thoughts. First of all, in the MSU sample language, there's a lot of attention given to sound and a great description of kind of what you might need to think about, and what I said here about both the measure and the method. So I would point you to there. Another piece to keep in mind is to think about what else you regulate sound on. What other kind of land uses you have sound regulations for. If you have sound regulations for other land uses and you have a method of kind of enforcing those, then carrying those through makes a whole lot of sense. If you don't regulate sound for anything else, then really maybe regulating instead, focusing on the setback distance as your sound mitigation technique is the simpler thing to do in your particular place. The other thing that's that I let communities know, and this is in the MSU wind guide as well, is that if you're really thinking that wind is not compatible in a particular, in a particular district in your community, you need to make space for it, but maybe there's not some place that's really great. You could effectively use the precautionary principle, and the case that you want to make is that we're worried about the sound impacts and the stress that it might cause on residents. using the precautionary principle, and the World Health Organization Europe has some sound limits associated with wind development that are pretty stringent. It's based on some research there about annoyance associated with sound, but that is, you can get the numbers from the wind, from MSU Wind Guide, but that's one thing that is possible to keep in mind, that may be effectively science-based defense for a more stringent sound regulation. Another section that's often regulated within a wind ordinance, that's similarly aimed to protect public health and safety is about shadow flicker. We talked about this very briefly, I think, when we did the last training. This shadow flicker is when there is effectively when the wind turbine is between you and the sun and the blades are rotating, and so every time it spins, you are effectively in its shadow, and it has a strobe type effect. Many ordinances set a maximum number of hours that any kind of property line or any house may be subject to this, to shadow flicker. Lower 30 hours is pretty common. Lower levels are possible for a wind farm to attain, but they're more costly, because effectively the way that a wind farm would comply with a number under 30 is to turn off turbines when it's the time of day and the time of year that they're going to produce flicker. All of that is predictable, and actually it's both predictable, and then you have to say, like, oh, is it sunny out? So there's actually technology that they can kind of put on the turbine to say, is it sunny enough to produce flicker? But it's, if you want something, but by turning that turbine off to comply with the flicker requirements, it does, you know, there's a missed opportunity to generate power there. So that's where it's kind of more costly. Other ways, and the kind of language that's given in the MSU sample ordinance for complying, are to have vegetative buffers or fences or buildings that kind of interfere with any potential flicker. And as I noted before, it's possible to shut the turbine down. Very commonly, because one of the key concerns that community members have about wind turbines is about the visual impacts that they have, both day and night, there's a number of elements within the MSU sample language to mitigate visual impacts of turbines. There's language on making sure that they have non-obtrusive colors, non-reflective surfaces in terms of their painting, prohibiting or limiting advertising or signage on the turbines themselves. You probably want some safety signage on the ground level, but maybe not up in the air. It's common to effectively say that there shouldn't be any lights beyond the FAA requirements. But in keeping with, like, the FAA does require that blinking red light for safety purposes. So you can't say no lights at all. But one of the things, if the night impact is something that's important to the community, you can require that the person who's proposing a wind farm ask the FAA for this aircraft detection lighting system, ADLS, that effectively turns off those lights except when a plane comes in the vicinity of the wind farm. So all of that language is covered in the MSU sample ordinance. There's a bunch of other things too about having performance securities for local roads. There's regulations on ground clearance. So that's the distance between the bottom of the blade spinning and the ground. There's, you know, language that you can pull about making sure that the applicant comply with Eagle and FAA and Fish and Wildlife Service permitting procedures, that they, you know, have the appropriate follow the appropriate electrical and building codes, safety signage, complaint resolution processes, lots of other potential language in there. There are two more elements that are important for wind, but they're also important for solar. So I'm going to stop and get a drink of water and let Madeleine take over. But before I do that, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Don't see any questions that came in during chat. I lulled you into a, I don't know, state of not asking questions. But I'm curious if anybody wants to either raise their hand or unmute to verbally ask a question if there's anything else on wind before we move to solar. There's a question about batteries, and I'm gonna put that down because I want to come back to that at the end. Actually, Madeleine and I are working right now on a battery guide, so. Nothing else on wind. So Madeleine's going to talk about the last couple of things while I get myself some water.
Right. Okay, thank you, Sarah. So as she mentioned, there are two considerations or two aspects to consider that both apply to wind and solar. This is a little bit of a transition away from wind and towards solar, but there's two things that apply to both of them. Which also apply to like the large utility scale wind and solar projects. So the first one is the site plan, as we assume that you would request for a site plan submission with these big type of projects. So you could request different types of analyses and studies to be submitted along with the site plan for a renewable energy project, either wind or solar, such as noise impact analysis, traffic analysis, and so on. There's existing sample language for both wind and solar with regards to the site plan. And while it's totally reasonable to include some of these requirements, you'd want to make sure that the elements that you're calling for or the studies that you're calling for are matching stipulations in the standards of approval. For example, if you call for a noise impact analysis, but you're not setting noise limitation stipulations, then there's a bit of a mismatch. So what you require should, just as with any other of the stipulations you set, be consistent with what you require for other land uses in order to arbitrate potential disputes surrounding issues of like placing extra scrutiny on wind or solar energy as a land use. So next to the site plan, the second aspect that both applies to wind and solar and is particularly relevant to large-scale utility wind and solar projects is to consider the so-called end of life and what happens after a project lifetime of maybe 25 to 30 years. So many ordinances on wind and solar do include stipulations on decommissioning, which refers to the removal of the energy infrastructure so that the land is ready for redevelopment or to return to its original use, such as agricultural land, for example. And repowering, on the contrary, very few ordinances in Michigan include stipulations on repowering, which refers to the reconfiguration, renovation, and replacement of an energy system. But before I dive deeper into repowering for each wind and solar, let's look at the central components of a decommissioning plan. So first of all, your zoning ordinance language should require an applicant to submit a decommissioning plan, laying out the manner in which the project shall be decommissioned. It should include a description of which above and below ground infrastructure and improvements shall be removed or retained or restored for viable reuse of the property consistent with a zoning district. For example, there might be infrastructure associated with a wind or solar project that you'd like to remain in place, such as access roads after a wind project has come to its end, for example. So similarly, some communities might prefer to have fences or vegetation used for screening in a solar project, for instance, remain and serve as a future and serve the future use of the land in that area. But if you do not want to have any infrastructure remain whatsoever, you can explicitly say so in the decommissioning plan as well. Next, your ordinance should be specific about the timing of when decommissioning should kick in. So, for example, you could stipulate that decommissioning must commence within a certain amount of time of abandonment. Our sample language includes that specification on decommissioning, or that decommissioning should only happen when the soil is dry to prevent soil compaction, which would hinder agricultural use on the property afterwards. So when considering a time period to like fill in this blank sentence, for example, you could also, or you should also consider allowing for sufficient time for repairs before the decommissioning process kicks in. If there are like supply chain issues and things are taking longer to repair, you wouldn't want decommissioning to kick in at that point. Additionally, your ordinance should also be specific about a project owner being able to proceed with the decommissioning plan at any time, maybe earlier than anticipated, or for a project owner to be able to request approval from either the planning commission or the zoning administrator to amend the decommissioning plan in case circumstances change over time. Let me give you an example for this. So imagine that a decommissioning plan for utility wind stipulates to remove all infrastructure, including all the access roads, including every single thing. As maybe at the beginning, when that plan was, or when the zoning ordinance was made, the idea was to later return that land back to agricultural use and have free land. But then 30 years down the road, circumstances maybe have changed and there's been rezoning in place. So now that there's residential or industrial development around the wind project, so now the access roads would be actually a great asset to keep on the land to serve more residential and commercial development once the wind turbines have been taken down in this scenario. So a project owner could request to amend the decommissioning plan to now allow for access roads to remain after everything else, the other infrastructure has been removed. As a last word on decommissioning, a note on the very important funding for decommissioning. So the decommissioning plan should include the projected cost for the removal of the wind or solar energy system. And if a solar project is on PA 116 land, we talked about that the last time too, that solar projects are possible on PA 116 land. The amount of the removal cost should be reduced by the amount that is covered by the surety bond that the state requires for PA 116 land. I mean, it's your township to decide if it makes sense to have the same project cover in two different bonds, but yeah. Secondly, the decommissioning plan should determine the method of ensuring that sufficient funds will be available to ensure that the complete removal of that system and the restoration of the site as per your decommissioning plan are going through. For example, in a form of a surety bond and cash deposit, etc. Lastly, the sample language that we have, or that is included in the guidebook, proposes to include into your ordinance language that the amount of the performance guarantee to be reviewed every couple of years, 3 to 5 years, to allow for changing market conditions of removal costs, such as when recycling technology is advanced or is now more expensive, etc., or inflation. To conclude, every zoning ordinance on utility scale wind and solar systems should include a decommissioning plan, but very few ordinances include language on repowering, which suggests that in a couple of years, when the oldest wind projects in Michigan are going to come to an end, there will be conversations happening in these hosting communities on repowering. So if you're rezoning now, we recommend that you include if and how you want to allow for repowering of utility scale wind projects in your community to kind of plan ahead for that. The benefits of repowering wind energy developments, despite more attention being on decommissioning, is that repowering may be less expensive than building a totally new project elsewhere, since much of the support infrastructure is already in place. Repowering also reinvests into the hosting into your community, where the members already have a familiarity with wind energy technology and might wish to retain the economic benefits. If you do decide to incorporate repowering into your ordinance, then there are two kinds of repowering types to keep in mind, which is full and partial. Full repowering involves decommissioning the existing turbines and replacing them with completely new ones. These projects might require larger infrastructure updates to support the complete new turbines, and it's likely that there will be changes to a project's layout and its dimensions. For example, if fewer, more efficient turbines replace many but less efficient turbines. Then a repowering project could reduce the visual impact of the development in the landscape by reducing the amount of turbines, but they might be bigger to generate comparable power as before. Partial repowering, on the other hand, allows some portions of the existing turbine to remain. Only certain components are replaced or refurbished. For example, the tower of the wind turbine, like the trunk, so to speak, might remain, but the blades might be replaced with longer ones, which then makes the turbine more efficient, but also making the turbine taller, since the blades are longer and reaching higher. In all cases, repowering projects acquire an extension of many of the agreements associated with the development, such as power purchase agreements, land lease agreements, and extensions of lease agreements may be welcomed by landowners as an opportunity to continue receiving revenue from hosting the turbines on their land, though some leaseholders may also opt to not extend the lease, at which point decommissioning would kick in. For solar energy, repowering looks a little bit different. This is a brief visual depiction of how repowering or thinking about repowering with regards to solar is so important. With solar, there is no differentiation between full and partial repowering as there is with wind, but rather along the lines of the evolution of solar technology advancement. So 10 years ago, a typical solar project would have fixed panels, as shown in the very first picture on the left. And for us in Michigan, these would typically be rows of panels running from east to west to make the most use of the sun's path across the sky on the southern horizon. But more recently, single-axis tracking panels are commonly used to track the sun and move with the sun and generate more energy with the same amount of panels. So these systems are typically in north-south rows. In the future, these systems could potentially be replaced, or we might see an increased development of agrivoltaics, so solar panels lifted up with agricultural activity below, or vertical solar panels, which somewhat look like a fence with panels attached and those cover less area. All this goes to say that the technology around solar energy is evolving. So while we expect a solar project that's built today to be in place for as little as 25 years, possibly longer, we're expecting to see massive technology advancements that will make an earlier layout or orientation of a solar energy system obsolete. So it makes sense that we allow for a system to be repowered without unnecessarily burdensome review processes if the system is simply reworked within its existing footprint, as that is what zoning is most concerned with. And our solar guidebook includes sample language on repowering for solar energy systems that you could decide to incorporate into your ordinance or not. Now that we have covered some aspects of zoning that are both applicable to wind and solar, this was a little bit of our transition into zoning specific or zoning considerations specific to solar energy, for which I'm going to hand back over to Sarah, unless there is questions specifically for these two aspects, being the site plan and end of life considerations. Are there?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have any questions for Madeleine, you can go ahead and raise your hand, unmute, or type them in. We can also get them at the end too. All right. Seeing none, I'm gonna keep trucking on zoning for solar. For a short bit, we've talked a lot about, or Madeleine started to talk about the kind of regulations that you would want associated with a large solar infrastructure. But for just a couple minutes, we're also going to talk about the fact that solar is possible at all different kinds of scales and kind of across kind of the urban and rural gradient. So there's accessory roof mounted structures that could be possible, all, you know, from very rural natural environments all the way to really urban places where it's going to be on a flat roof. Accessory ground mounted, so this is backyard or side of the farm solar, but also this is accessory to, in this case, it's solar carports accessory to a parking lot. There's, there's small principal use opportunities in, again, rural and urban environments. And the same is true with large principal use, effectively solar farms. So for solar, you're going to want to make sure, as we had talked about before with wind, that you're thinking about all of these 4 scales or 4 kind of permutations of solar and how they might fit across your generic, in this case, it's generic zoning districts, but you've got to figure out how they fit in each of your zoning districts. For roof mounted and accessory ground mounted systems where the power is going to be used on that site first, oftentimes, this is from the solar guidebook, it's appropriate to have them as permitted. That's what the P stands for here, a permitted use in those districts. But that may not be the case once we start to talk about principal use solar farms. Here you can see some areas where they might be done with kind of administrative, where it may be very appropriate and done through kind of administrative site plan review, or where they might be treated as special land use, or some districts here shown in S where they're not appropriate at all. So, you know, a large solar farm in a residential area, whether that's low density or higher density or kind of more downtown mixed use urban environments. So those are decisions that you're going to have to decide. And I encourage you to decide when, you know, once you're going back to zone for solar, to do it for all of the different permutations of solar. We're going to start and keep just for a couple more slides on the really small solar, small scale of solar systems, and then we'll go up to the solar farms. So for roof mounted systems, my sense is probably many of you have roof mounted systems in your community, even if your zoning ordinance is silent on it, because you're just treating it as any other roof material. And being explicit and carrying that through in your zoning ordinances would be the most appropriate thing to do. You may actually be, you may give additional consideration to solar, and that this is some language, again, that's pulled from the solar guidebook that we developed in cooperation with, in coordination with Michigan State. For example, you might allow for height exceedance. Oftentimes we, you know, think about solar panels as being along the same plane as the roof, but in areas in kind of a more, maybe in the village or in the city where you might have a flat roof, you may want to allow for roof mounted solar panels to exceed, you know, 5 feet, honestly, is probably enough above that finished roof, or to kind of add exceptions, or to add solar to a table of exceptions that you might have for other kind of roof mounted mechanical equipment. In terms of, again, I've got one slide on what you would have for accessory ground mounted panels. The common guidance that we give is to just take whatever you have for other accessory structures and carry that through for solar panels, for accessory ground mounted solar panels. So if you feel like you want to have additional regulations, you might consider height regulations, you know, not to exceed. This is the language from the guidebook. You can fill in the blank. to the top of the system when it's oriented and its maximum tilt, or again, just follow the height standards for other accessory structures in the district. The same is true for setbacks. Scale those setbacks based on what you already have for accessory structures in the district that it's being placed at. So it could be just a small amount of text, just being explicit that solar panels are treated as accessories, you know, should follow the regulations for accessory structures in your district. Where there is lots of pages in the guidebook and where you're going to want to give more thought is to principal use solar energy systems. So these are solar farms. And in the guidebook, we distinguish between two different sizes of systems or scales of systems: principal use small and principal use large. We don't determine what that cut line should be, because what is small in a city, or what is large in a city, looks different than what large might look like in a township, out in a township. So effectively what you want to do is think about what is something that is going to, you know, blend in more or less with the landscape and the kind of size of developments that you have in your particular place, and those would be designated as small. We've got language to designate it based on the megawatts, the kind of energy and this is something that is measurable, but again, to keep in tune with changes in technology and perhaps not stand in the way if there are changes in technology that make more megawatts viable in that same footprint. I think from a planning perspective, you might want to kind of set your line based on how many acres the project takes up. And the reason that you're going to draw this distinction is because the rules are less onerous for small systems than they would be for large systems. Again, for something that is going to just blend in, maybe you don't treat it as permitted by right, but you have more of an administrative review rather than a full, you know, special, treated as a full special land use within your ordinance. The provisions that we have for these small solar farms are, for ground cover in particular, are one of the key places where it's different. So for ground cover for small solar farms, effectively the only requirement is that there's installation of perennial ground cover, so some kind of grass, just so that, you know, you don't have bare earth. Small solar farms are more possible. That scale is more likely to happen on a brownfield or on a old parking lot, or even, on a brownfield or old parking lot. So you may want to have some provisions that effectively say if that site is already have a lot of imperviousness, or there's a brownfield plan, that you're exempt from those ground cover requirements. It's common to set a height limit. It doesn't need to be super tall, but if you do want agricultural activity to happen underneath it, or if you do want there to be parking or something underneath it, then, you know, you need to accommodate for that. And so that would be a reason to have a number around 20 feet. Otherwise, for most kind of solar farm installations, something closer to 14 feet is more than adequate. For a solar farm, the National Electric Code is going to require a fence around it. Within the guidebook, there's language associated with fencing. The key point that you want, a couple key decision points. If you want to have wildlife friendly fencing, we showed a picture when we gave the first training about like a fox kind of going through the fence. If you want that kind where small critters can get through, then you need to ask for it. That's not, you know, you could also have chain link fence, and there's not gonna, you know, chain link's not super wildlife friendly. Also, if you don't want barbed wire, you should stipulate that. The current National Electric Code for solar farms requires either 6 feet of fencing with 3 rows of barbed wire on the top, or a slightly taller 7-foot fence. So if you prefer the not barbed wire version, then we've got language that you can include into your ordinance. For both large and small solar farms, even though it's really common in a zoning ordinance to regulate for maximum lot coverage, we explicitly make solar farms exempt. And the reason is that it's really hard to figure out what the lot coverage is in a situation where it's not actually imperviousness underneath it. It may be vegetated. Also tricky to figure out what the lot coverage is when these solar panels are tilting throughout the course of the day. So if you do choose to regulate for maximum lot area coverage, you need to be really explicit about how you are measuring that. There have been multiple lawsuits in the state where people had different senses of what should be measured. So if you choose to regulate for maximum lot coverage, just be explicit. Again, the other reason that we arrived at being okay exempting this from lot area coverage was in part because of these ground cover standards. So often you care about maximum lot area coverage from a stormwater perspective. And if you are requiring perennial ground cover there, that's one way to accommodate, to take care of stormwater concerns. This is not imperviousness. It will be, that water kind of will be soaked up on that site. Another reason that you might regulate for maximum lot area coverage is to minimize kind of visual clutter on that site. And so if that's the real reason driving your lot area coverage, then maybe you do want to extend it to solar. But again, be real clear about how to do that measurement. Another standard that you would want to include in your solar ordinances, in your solar provisions, is on screening. We mentioned last time, I think, that I'm real big on being consistent across land uses. And so where we start out with is following the screening or landscaping standards for the district that solar farm is going to be in. If it's determined, and we have this language in the solar guidebook, if the landscaping standards seem to be inadequate, then the zoning administrator or the planning commission can require, and then you can plug in language, some deciduous trees planted, name the distance on center. Similarly, we have language to be flexible to reduce or waive the screening requirements if there's already kind of something that is providing that visual screening, or it doesn't make sense to provide the visual screening in a particular area. So the language in the guidebook allows for both possibilities. Also, another regulation for both sizes of solar farm are associated with setbacks. So one thing that's in the language that I would say is really important for both scales is that you're explicit that you're calculating the setback from the property line or road right of way to the closest point at maximum or minimum, or at minimum tilt, the flattest position of those solar panels. That's really important, especially in the day and age that we have right now of kind of tilting, rotating throughout the day solar panels. Both for a solar farm, it's pretty common that there may be more than one parcel involved. They're kind of a solar developer, like I showed you the hypothetical example of a wind developer, may be getting lots of neighboring properties together in order to amass enough land area. And so it's the most common strategy is to make sure that that the common property boundaries of participating parcels aren't subject to this setback. So effectively those solar panels can go right across the property line if that's how the developer arranges it, so that you don't have these weird strips in the middle of the solar farm between two otherwise participating property lines. Or to otherwise participating property owners. The solar guidebook does say that, even if you've got participants across the street from each other, you still have to have that setback from the road right of way. For small scale solar farms, small principal use solar energy systems. The guidebook starts where as the provision of the setback distance being the same as for primary buildings or structures in that district. For large solar energy systems, it starts with that language, but then also allows the opportunity if you want to have a greater distance. So to include, so many feet from the property line of a non-participating lot. Again, whichever is greater, you want to, the setbacks for that district or this number that you might set. I would suggest though that in setting this number, you should think about what is the biggest setback distance that you have from anything else. And if for solar, you're coming up with something that is bigger than anything else, that's not quite consistent. That's not thinking about this. So think about what, if you believe that there should be a larger setback, think about what is large in your community and kind of what you've already established as, a setback from a land use that you think warrants additional distance. You could also have a setback distance from an existing dwelling unit. So not just from the property line, but you could have a setback distance from a home itself. And again, you would want to distinguish between participating and non-participating properties, so that if somebody has an agreement, has a lease agreement, there's with the solar developer, they already can determine where on their property, like how close on their property they want it. And so that you're not necessarily overruling that. Again, most of the standards between these large and small solar energy systems, large and small solar farms are similar, but the one that's the biggest difference is associated with the ground cover. So, and in the large solar energy systems, it effectively requires a dual use ground cover. So kind of typical ground cover is, turf grass or kind of whatever comes up. Or, it's possible there's nothing that requires that there'd be vegetation underneath solar panels. You could just leave it bare earth. Most communities though, and where we arrived at in drafting the solar guidebook is that you may want that site to be doing more than just energy production. That you may want what's planted in and around those panels to have some additional function and provide some additional kind of benefit to the community. And so for ground cover options for these large solar energy systems, the guidebook offers 4. And I'm going to present them kind of in order from like easiest to attain to like most difficult to attain, I would say, from most communities' perspectives. The first one that you could require, and that I would say you probably should require, is some kind of conservation cover, so that it's designed in consultation with the conservation organization, the conservation district, to effectively plant something that provides habitat benefit or provide some sort of ecosystem service, so improving soil health. So that's one option that we count as dual use. Another option is effectively planting pollinator habitat. And we specifically reference the Michigan Pollinator Habitat Planning Scorecard for solar sites that MSU has put together. Among the reasons that this is something that you may want to put in as a possibility, because this is what's required of land that's planted that's in PA 116 that has solar on it. So this would be kind of compatible with what the state would be requiring the landowner to do too. Another option that you could require for land cover is planting forage mixes. So there's a solar grazing association that does a special seed mix that sheep like to eat. And so this way you have forage production as part, and sheep providing your maintenance on that site. And finally, the last one is agrivoltaics. So this is, while it's not very common, particularly at the scale of a large solar farm, to have crops growing underneath the solar panels, it's a possibility, and many communities would like to see that. And so we want to make sure that the solar guidebook isn't not allowing that, isn't ruling that out. And so we have some language that you may allow for agrivoltaic activities underneath, planting crops that thrive in shade. PA 116's come up a couple of times, and it came up the last time too, but kind of just summing it together. The regulations that would be required on land enrolled in PA 116 if it wants to put solar on it are that the field tile is maintained, that there's a cover crop planted that includes pollinator habitat that uses that scorecard that I just showed, and also that there's decommissioning plan and decommissioning bond or letter of credit posted with the state to make sure that the solar panels are going to be removed. So the sample ordinance that we have in the solar guidebook mirrors that and doesn't conflict with anything that the state would also require. I think I just have a couple more slides. While typically you would think of sound associated with turbines, when solar projects are certainly quieter, but there is one component within a solar farm that makes some noise, and that is the inverter that's converting the power that's produced to AC power that's going to go on the grid. So it goes from DC to AC. Different inverters have different sound levels, and so it doesn't hurt to just to make sure that you are having some sort of sound ordinance in place so that either quieter inverters are used or those inverters are pushed towards the center of your project. That's effectively, like we said before, sound dissipates with distance. And so that's one of the ways that's how a solar developer would meet your sound ordinance. Like before, and this language again is pulled from the solar guidebook, you need a number and you need a descriptor. So this is kind of how they're going to take that measurement of sound. Is it instantaneous or is it kind of averaged over a particular time period? Like for wind, you want to make sure that the site plan that is submitted includes modeled sound, but you might also want, so whatever noise or whatever you kind of pick out here, you want to make sure that it's not quieter than what's currently going on in that site. So you may want to have some pre-sound testing. And this is just what the inverters look like. Sometimes they can be lined up underneath the panels. Most commonly, they're kind of, they look like a large electrical chest effectively on a pad. I maybe should have showed you this. We gave these out the last time around. It's also available online. We've really been talking about things that you might consider as you're plugging into either the sample ordinance for wind energy systems or the solar guide that we passed out when we were together in January. Both of them are available from Eagle's website. And I'm thinking, actually, let me stop sharing. Madeleine can wrap us up at the very end about kind of what's coming. I'm going to get another drink of water while people think about what questions they have, and I catch up on what came in chat while I was talking. Okay, so Tammy asked a question about why the need for fencing. The need for fencing is just to minimize unauthorized access. So a wind turbine doesn't need fencing because the access to it, like sometimes there's an elevator. Often there's an elevator, sometimes there's stairs, but it's inside the turbine base behind a locked door. But for a solar farm, the National Electric Code wants the fence around it just so that people don't wander in. Field fence is often used, which can easily be cut. It's not like there's nothing in there that's going to be super damaging, but rather than people kind of climbing on panels, I think that's the intent behind why the NEC requires the fence. Do they completely clear out the site of all vegetation to install solar? That's a good question. My sense is that they're not going to like strip everything down. But necessarily they're going to clear out any brush that's there. But it's also like there's a lot of construction activity, right? So kind of a lot of the ground cover is going to be messed up a bit during the construction activity. Typically, it's not like they have to level the ground in order to construct a solar farm. And to some extent, I think that there's actually language in the solar guidebook that talks about limiting soil disturbance and kind of regrading to the minimal necessary. There's certainly, when we visit a solar farm in April, you can see that it's not been flattened. So let's see. Great. Those are the questions in chat. What else do people have? If you're on the phone and want to ask a question, you can do *9 raises your hand, *6 unmutes you. If you're here with us on Zoom, you can just unmute or raise your hand.
Sarah, while others may have another minute to think about a question, there was a question from earlier that is still to be answered, which is, how do the worn out batteries affect the environment? My understanding is that this is pointing at large scale energy storage batteries. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so there, and I don't know that we talked about it too much last time around in January. In order to, the cost of batteries to be able to keep the power on at night when the sun's down and when when wind may not be blowing, batteries are being deployed and the cost of those batteries is coming down. So we're seeing a lot of interest in large scale batteries. Those are lithium ion is the common technology that's used now. So they can't be, they're considered a hazardous waste, and they can't just be put into a landfill. Like they have to be recycled or sent to special site for that. I think that there's a lot of research on changing kind of the chemistry of it, and they haven't been deployed yet. So they haven't, kind of end of life considerations haven't come up yet. But that's an active area. So, and Madeleine and I are actually working on effectively creating a guidebook, but for batteries. So we're learning a lot too, and I'm glad that you're thinking about batteries because it should be on your radar. What else? Denise, what questions do you have?
Oh, you put me on the spot.
Totally.
I don't have it. I mean, you've covered everything really well. I'm trying to think if there's anything that you haven't. No, I can't think of anything.
Okay.
Everybody else is very quiet. We didn't have too many questions at the last one either in person.
We didn't.
Had more at the first one. So see?
We're anticipating all of your questions or lulling you to sleep. All right. Well, what I'll do, this is not your last opportunity to ask questions or to talk about zoning for any of these things. So now I'm going to share my screen again, but Madeleine's going to take it away.
Right. Thank you. So to give you a little bit of an outlook on what's to come. So last month we had part 1 introducing. Now we had part 2, which is diving a bit deeper already. And for March and April, we have the following things kind of sketched out. So we are planning on offering to you 4 online workshops, which we call the nuts and bolts, where we want to focus particularly on like the nitty-gritty of zoning, but those sessions will be largely influenced by you and your zoning ordinance. That will be the perfect time to bring your own ordinance, discuss it, ask questions, maybe reflect on stipulations in your current zoning ordinance, if they're ready to go, or if we might suggest updating certain sections. So the first of these workshops focuses on accessory use only, both solar and wind, but we're only talking about the small scale use of solar and wind. And then since principal use solar is such a huge field, we are going to split it up into 2 workshops. The one specific to site standards. So the first one will cover height, setbacks, screening, and fencing. And then for the second part on principal use solar site standards, we'll cover ground cover, stormwater management, lot area coverage, ag land considerations. So we kind of heard all of this before, but these sessions will really be offering the opportunity to talk very actively in a dialogue on your particular zoning ordinance. And then the last one, the 4th workshop, will be on principal use wind and solar. We're currently scheduling these workshops for the end of for March and April, and I will soon inform you when these are scheduled and when registration opens up. These also will be online in the evening, kind of the same time as today, hopefully to enable as many of you as possible to attend. And then last but not least, we are planning on offering the bus tour, and we've now kind of scheduled it down to the end of April, in the indicated week between April 24 and April 28. And this will be a whole day trip to see both a large scale solar and also wind system, to get a feeling for how does this feel and look and smell in real life. So we're looking very forward to organizing these with you and doing these further events with you. And I have all of your email addresses, so I will let you know when registration opens up. And in the meantime, you're very invited to send us emails or call us with your questions, or something Sarah and I are also doing are reviewing draft zoning ordinances for communities. We can offer presentations tailored to your particular township or county, and connect you to MSU Extension and the other communities. With that, if there's no more questions.
Can I add something real quick?
Yes.
For that nuts and bolts workshop, I would also say communities that don't have anything in their ordinance yet, that maybe have a draft ready, to bring that. And for those of you, I'm looking at Gordon here that I'm working with. You don't have a draft, Gordon, but I'll get you a draft before the nuts and bolts, so you at least have something that you can look at if you're planning on attending those. So
great. Amazing, Denise. Thank you.
He's giving me a thumbs up, so
we'll see you there, Gordon.
And I really encourage everybody to sign up for the bus tour, because it's totally worth it. I know it's a day, yeah, you burn a day, but it was completely worth it. And let's hope there's no snow.
No snow. We'll get some lunch too. Great. Well, again, don't hesitate to contact us. And obviously, you should always contact Denise. You guys have it so lucky to have Denise in your neck of the woods. And we look forward to talking to you more for the next set of trainings.
Oh, there's a question.
Oh, can we bring a guest on the bus tour? So we have really tried hard to make sure that we're not going over some of the same territory. So historically, we've said you need to participate in at least part number 1, the training, in order to get on the bus tour. But you should contact us. We can make exceptions. And there's also a recorded version of part number 1. We want everybody that's there to have some of the basics. We'll review things, but it's important that you guys have put in the time, and we want to make sure we're answering kind of the next level questions. So So it depends on the guest, I would say. How's that?